I think we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Today we are talking with the amazing SB Divya, who is joining us to talk about her debut novel, which is entitled Machinehood. And this is a very cool thing.
I'll show it off.
So there you
Shiny
go.
and
There you
chrome.
go. And beautiful book. Beautiful, just yay. So I'm excited. This is your debut, right?
Yeah, I'm
Was it a
very
long
excited.
time in the making, or?
It depends on, I guess, your definition of long. It's not one of these that I've been slogging over for decades. But I started writing it in 2017, actually about exactly 4 years ago.
Okay.
And it was about a 2-year process before it went on submission. So not that bad, I guess, but not super speedy either.
Cool.
How
And
was the process?
so
Oh, sorry.
no, it's okay. Go ahead, Paul.
How was the process different between writing this and writing Runtime?
Oh my gosh.
Besides the length.
Night and day. When I wrote Runtime, I had written, several short stories. I'd had a couple of flash fiction pieces published, but I was able to just kind of do like a very rough outline, a couple lines for each of the 5 acts. And then I just kind of dove in and wrote it in the space of about 5 weeks. I actually wrote the first draft of Runtime for a codex contest. And so we had a limited amount of time in which, we were allowed to work on it. And so, then basically it sat for like 6 months until I heard about Tor.com having open submissions, because this was back in 2015. And so I spent about a month fixing it up, figured I could send it over to them and forget about it, because it was a very awkward length. It was like 19,000 words, and it was like a little too long for most of the magazines, except for a few, and too short for anything bookish. But then when I sat down to write Machinehood, I had written a Runtime, I had written a couple of other novella length things. And so I figured, okay, I'm shooting for, 75 to 80,000 words for my first draft. That's like 4 novellas. So that should be no big deal, right? Because I've done that already. And so I did the same thing. I kind of like roughed out a few of my major beat points, did a little bit more on the world building side, and then just dove right in. And halfway through realized that, it would be much better if I did XYZ in the first half. So I wrote the second half a little differently, and then went back and fixed that first half. And then it was still just a giant hot mess of a manuscript. And so I sent it to my agent and I said, I know this is a mess, but I want to know if I should work on it or just like insta trunk it and, write something else, now that I have actually learned what it takes to write a novel, which is completely different from what it takes to write a 20,000 word novella. And then I let my husband read it because we were flying back from Australia and he was curious. So I was like, sure, you can read it. And he loved it. And my agent agreed that it was a giant mess. But she was like, I could probably sell it if you fix it. So I spent a year and a half basically fixing the thing and really like learning how to write a novel, because full disclosure, this is the first novel length thing I have ever written in my life. I did novella way back in my college years, and I did about 40,000 words on NaNoWriMo back in 2011. That was basically trash, but at least proved to myself that I could write 40,000 words in my life. And then that was it. And then it was Machinehood. So I came in with, no experience and a giant pile of naivete, thinking that it's just a scaling up of a novella by a factor of 4, but that's clearly not what it is at all.
Well, I'm glad that you made it through the process, because there's this beautiful, beautiful result.
Indeed. And I applied all my lessons to a new book that I started last year, and that has gone much more smoothly, I must say.
So this is a story that takes place in our future. What was the process of creating our future like for you?
This particular future, which I had originally envisioned like about 100 years out, and I ended up pulling it back just because things are happening so fast that 100 years seemed unrealistic. So now it's more like 75 years out. And a lot of it was just me putting together my technical knowledge, my interests in science, and what I'd kind of heard in terms of existential concerns by people within the tech industry and by my friends in terms of what they're worried about, for this upcoming rest of this century. And one of the big one is climate change, right? But another big one is automation and jobs, especially again, because I was an engineer coming from the tech sector, heavily influenced by the conversations happening in those spaces, especially in terms of machine learning and AI. There's this whole like, what are people going to do when the robots take all their jobs? Because they're getting very smart and capable, and they're going to get more smart and more capable, in the next 50 years. And so I did some research. I read like some global foresight stuff, talked to someone in the State Department about, plausible geopolitics that I wanted to introduce.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was very cool. Talked to someone who worked at the CIA to get a little bit of insight on, how that whole world works, because I know nothing about it. So I wanted, at least some amount of credibility in building a character.
If you'll forgive me,
yeah.
Can you tell me, did you just go, I need to talk to somebody from the CIA?
No,
better go find someone, or do you know somebody?
No,
or did you know somebody?
It fell into my lap because while I was still in the planning stages, I think, or maybe after I'd kind of started and I knew that my main character was going to be this ex-special forces person who's going to get involved in intelligence work. I happened to be at a wedding for my husband's colleague, of all things, on this lovely yacht in Newport Harbor. And just chatting with people, and it turns out the groom's brother had worked at the CIA and was a Marine, former Marine. So I was like, would you be willing to hop on the phone with me for an hour so I can kind of pick your brain about some stuff that I want to put in my novel? and he was like, oh yeah, sure. So like, we
that's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. And so it's just, it's one of those things where, because it was on my mind and I happened to make that connection at that time, it just worked out. It was serendipity, I guess, that worked in my favor. But I also picked up some books. I read a book, like a autobiographical thing about a guy who worked in the CIA in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and kind of, I think even in the 90s a little bit, and his whole experience and his life. And then I read some other books about economics and labor conflicts of the previous century, because I saw a lot of parallels as I was doing that research between what happened in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s and what I could see happening right now. And so I was like, if this, then that, kind of like, here are the patterns from that time period. What could it look like if I applied a similar template to what's going on now, but instead of, people moving from farms to factories, they're moving from office jobs to basically helping robots. And so that combined with just for fun, like all the stuff with CRISPR and biotech, I was like, what if biotech is sort of the next big revolution for this century, the way computers changed the landscape in the last century? This is the aspect of Machinehood that I'm probably least sold on as gonna happen, but I figured it could happen. So let's suppose it does happen, how is it going to play into these labor conflicts and the economy of the future? And try to be very realistic. And I actually mapped out what happens in each decade between now and then, like roughly in terms of these different aspects. So like when biotech becomes widespread, when, automation via AI becomes more widespread, when the first commercial space station opens up for people to go and live on, the invention of the micropill, which is very important to this story, which is the thing that human beings are taking to enhance their bodies. So I did actually spend some time in my world building, like figuring out the details of how we get to 2095
That's pretty cool.
from today.
Can you tell us more about the micropills? Because they're clearly quite important.
Yeah. So this was an idea I had after kind of looking at cyberpunk, right? Which was conceived in the 80s when computers were still big and bulky, and so were machines, right? Transistors were getting smaller, but the actual computer hardware was still pretty big. And so like our pop culture vision of, or maybe even just the common science fiction conception of the cyborg is like someone with like these big machine parts, like bolted all onto them, or, surgically attached to their bodies in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, really, who wants to do that? Like nobody really wants to go into surgery. I mean, yes, they will because it's going to give them these benefits, but ideally we could all cyborg ourselves without the big bulky machines, right? That would be much better. For example, if we could take a pill and the pill is full of micro machines and nano machines, and this is a thing that's happening in labs. So that was partly the inspiration, was there's all these people right now trying to develop and actually having developed pills that you can swallow, from which little devices will unfold as the gel capsule dissolves in your stomach. And they're using this for various diagnostics, like taking colon samples. Hey, no more colonoscopy, right? Like this is good. Or even letting you ingest a tiny camera and then using magnetics to guide it through your body while they retrieve video, right? So no more endoscopy, like everything becomes much less invasive. This is a good thing. So just kind of extended that a little bit forward to like, okay, what if, the new cyborg is someone that looks just like you do right now from the outside, but on the inside has these little machines that work in their swarm capacities to do various enhancing things the way we want from cybernetics. So that's where the micropill came in. And then once I got there, I was like, why, right? I always like to know why these things happen, even in my imaginary worlds of the future. Like, why are people taking these pills? Other than, okay, they might be cool, but they're probably going to cost something. So unless there's some financial benefit, outside of medical necessity, why would this become a commercial widespread product? And the answer I developed was because of these AIs that they're competing with, right? Or even collaborating with. So initially they're competing with them. And then by the time Machinehood takes place, in a large part, they're actually working with the machines. But to keep up with the machines, they got to take these pills so they can be faster or stronger or have better concentration and multitasking. So that pill is kind of driving this economic cycle, and then there are people developing new pill designs, so it's kind of its own little capitalistic ecosystem.
Right. And so that's one of the key demands. And can you tell us about that? So the Machinehood itself is mysterious, at least at first,
right?
But they have a list of demands, and one of those demands is stop using the micropills, right?
Right. Stop using the micropills, stop producing them, stop allowing human beings to compete with the AIs, because it's not good for the AIs and it's not really good for the humans either, which is illustrated by the fact that the main character, Valga Ramirez, who takes these pills as part of her job to enhance her physical abilities, is starting to develop tremors, and they're not sure if it's related to the pills, but her AI is telling her that look, there's a pretty strong correlation between, when you're coming down off of these pills and when your tremors start up. So quite possibly there's some relationship there that you should look into. And that plays into, I guess, sort of these bigger picture social concerns that I wanted to explore that, we've been having, I think, probably since the dawn of human history, but it's like, what are the trade-offs we make between our health and our needs to live, thrive, and work in the world, right? And there's always trade-offs, and we're making trade-offs today. And so I really kind of wanted to look at that as what are these trade-offs these people are making in the future, right? And how is that going to drive their conflicts?
Yeah, that's cool. So one of the things that I really liked was the way that you take these very, very large scale extrapolative historical questions and trends and stuff, and you turn it into the daily life of actual people. What daily life questions are so important for making a world happen. Was that something that you deliberately pursued when you were putting this together?
Yeah, 100%. When I was choosing my secondary character, I explicitly chose someone who was not in a position of authority, who is not going to be in the middle of the action, who is going to present that domestic, ordinary, day-to-day routine of what it's like to live and inhabit in this world. And I did it also because I feel like not enough science fiction spends time in the domestic world, right? Like it's always about the person going out to have adventures or like, the president or the emperor, or whoever's in charge of entire nations and the fate of millions. It's like, okay, but like, what about that person who's just, living in their house with their kid and their spouse and just, trying to make a go of it, right? Like, why I know like why it's always more exciting to follow the person, with all the power or in the middle of the action. But I think it can be equally interesting, especially when it comes to either secondary world fantasy or science fiction, where you can really play with a lot of these details, right?
Yeah.
To explore like, what is it like to inhabit this world, right? Like, what are the everyday things like that? And so and then because I think also a lot of these economic concerns have to do with people with families, right? Where, you're trying to balance your priorities with your children's priorities, their future, your present, your parents, elder care, like all of these things that come into play. And I feel like these are stories that are just not told often enough. And I find them interesting. So I decided to throw it in there. And, not all readers love it. Some people prefer one character's point of view to the other. Some people find, it's been interesting because it's like, I feel like some people are fine with the whole thing, but there are some people who really like the action heavy plot thread and think the domestic one is a complete waste of time. And then, there's some people who are the opposite. They really like the quiet domestic story and they can relate to that one much better than the action techno thriller type plot.
Yeah.
So it's like there's this A plot and this B plot, and there are some people who seem to fall very solidly into one camp or another, and others who thankfully bridge the whole thing and like all of it. But I did very deliberately want to present that, that point of view, that style of view that I feel like often gets overlooked in a lot of speculative fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. So, would you like to tell us a little bit more specifically about the two main plot threads and the characters that are the people at the center of them?
Yeah, sure. So the A plot is like a Tom Clancy style, action thriller. Your hero, Hugo Ramirez, is former special forces turned a kind of private security. And she's just turning 35 at the beginning of the book, and she's about to get retired because there's this whole performative aspect of the future where, There's always cameras everywhere. Somebody's always watching potentially. You can even earn money for just the choices you're making in your regular life. And so the people who are employing her are like, yeah, at 35, like, we need younger people who look better. So you're done. At that point, you can go have a desk job. You can keep working in this particular field, but you can't be like out in the field actively on camera. Or you just take a nice, retirement and find something else to do for the rest of your life. And so she gets embroiled very early on, right in the middle of the action, when this mysterious new organization called the Machinehood attacks the person that she's been trying to protect and kills them in full view of everyone. And the B plot is her sister-in-law, who lives on the other side of the planet. So, the main character is based mostly in the USA, and her sister-in-law and her brother, Luis, live in Chennai, in India. And so they're on the other side of the planet, kind of representing the two halves of myself. One American, one Indian. And her sister-in-law is the B plot. And she is, one of these biotech scientists. She has a 7-year-old daughter. She has, her spouse. She's working. She's trying to balance these things. And Welga goes to her and asks if she'll look into these tremors she's having, because she doesn't want to, she's not having any luck finding any doctors or researchers who are interested in taking on her case, because that's the world they live in. And she doesn't want to really disclose it yet because she wants to help take down this shadowy new organization. So the B plot is really about a lot of personal domestic stuff, as well as, trying to get to the bottom of what's happening with Welga and these zips, and, the fundamental conflict, like I was referring to earlier, between the trade-offs we make in order to have health or employment. And so that's kind of where the B plot really weaves into the themes.
That's very cool.
So I have a question. You talked initially about how you thought it would be just like scaling up the writing process for writing a novella, which is how I thought about it before my first book, and I was equally wrong. But you also talked about working out the future history of the technology and the world building decade after decade, and you talked about having a initial sprint to write the first draft. At what point did the world building occur? Before you started that first draft with all your like idealism and I'll just make a longer novella, or was it after the first draft and before the revision, or during that? How and when did you do the world building aspect of it in the creation process?
Yeah, so I actually did the world building before I sat down to write that first draft. So I spent, I think, about a month. I went and checked out like a pile of books at the library. I will never forget, because they were closing early that day. I didn't realize it. So I was kind of frantically like, okay, I need, like econ, CIA, future of technology, future of science, like labor conflict. So it was like the stack of books that I was just like, okay, good enough. Whatever they had, I went, I checked it out. And I spent a few weeks, I didn't read them cover to cover, but just kind of like mining them for ideas and figuring out my very rough character basics, who my two protagonists were going to be, who my primary antagonist was going to be. And then I spent like probably a couple weeks, while I was reading, I was taking notes, and like the idea for the world building was gelling in my head. But I really did need to kind of know that progression, because I already knew that some of what happens in the present day for the Machinehood was going to depend on things that had happened in the prior decades, right? So I needed to know in which decade, like, the first riots happened and the protests against automation, and then, the second round of riots and protests against the early pill development, which was highly deregulated and caused massive health problems. Things like the pandemic decades that led to the deregulation of biotech and why people are, designing all these things, pills that not just enhance your body, but that also protect you from pathogens and biohacked viruses and things like that.
Mhm.
So I think I had all of those pieces pretty much in place. Like I said, it was set a little bit further, so I contracted that timeline when I was revising, but the main pieces of it didn't really change. What really changed after that first draft was the plot.
Mhm.
I struggle with plot in general. Runtime was easy because it was like, young person enters a race, tries to win, right? Like very, very straightforward plot. There are some obstacles and surprises along the way that are setbacks, but really straightforward. Versus Machinehood, I knew was going to be something of a thriller. So I like read up on the Cliffs Notes basically of things like The Hunt for Red October, and like I think I read Jean le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I was just like, okay, like what's kind of the general, format for the thriller? Had a rough idea of the plot, but after I wrote that first draft, I went back and did the chapter by chapter breakdown. And then I really kind of dug in and analyzed the plot much better and realized, what I ripped out like large chunks of that first draft, right? Like I think entire chapters got thrown away from the first third, and entire new ones got written into the third act. And things, merged and whatever, right? Like it's the revision process.
It is.
But
I'm over here smiling because I totally relate. I'm like, oh, this sounds so familiar. Oh my God.
I know, I was like, why in my I guess in my infancy as a novel writer, did I have to choose a thriller? It's like one of the hardest plot structures to write, and I just didn't know when I got into it. I'm like, of all the things to choose, like that was probably the hardest. But
and yet you made it work.
And eventually I made it work after I think about 5 major revisions this book went through, and restructuring. But yeah, I wish, had I known what I know today when I started, I would have plotted this thing out so much better. And then, even when I thought it was all done and fine, right? Like it had gone through my agent, it had gone through beta readers, agent multiple times, my editor, my other editor after it got orphaned. And
oh my goodness.
And then it gets to, I think it was the copy editor. Yeah, copy editor first caught a few like timeline glitches. So I fixed those. I'm like, that took a weekend it was like totally harrowing because I was just like, like things happen very fast. It's a thriller. So like, where do I find like 5 hours for this, And then
yeah.
And then I fixed that, I thought. And the second round of proofreads, I think, the first or second round of proofreads, no, it must have been the first round. The proofreaders caught more things, some of which I had introduced when I fixed the first things, but some of which nobody had paid attention to until then, which had to do with the time zone difference between the US and India, right? Because it's a 12-hour time delta, right? Like, which we can all relate to now because we've all experienced time zone madness thanks to the pandemic. So literally for like 4 days, I was tearing my hair out because I was like, I hadn't planned the timeline well enough when I wrote the book. Even when I went back and did my reverse outlining and all of that, I had a rough timeline, but not like to the time of day, which was what ultimately I had to do. Like this happens in, Los Angeles at this hour, at which point in India, it is this hour on this day. And I was
yeah.
So I had these 2 columns of like, okay, what time and day is it in the US? What time and day is in India for like every single scene?
Talk about world building.
And had I done this all up front, this is what experience teaches you, right? Like I could have written it correctly the first time, but since I didn't, and I was on, almost the final version before it went to print, I couldn't change like big chunks. I couldn't add a day or two, just cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I had to just figure out like where I had margin and then basically like retcon things to fit into or like stretch those margins out into other places. It was
Wow.
it was fun and exciting and extremely stressful.
I am sure it sounds terribly stressful to be going through that at such a late point in the process.
Yeah.
But
I made it work. I did. I made it work somehow. I pulled it off, and then I was like, nobody's ever going to care or pay attention to this unless it becomes like a mega best-selling, I don't know, iconic piece of science fiction of the kind that like people are actually nerding out and paying attention to this
right,
stuff,
and
right?
microanalyzing.
Yeah, like I think even if it gets optioned for a movie, they're not gonna care, right? They're gonna be like, yeah, whatever, like timeline, sure, we'll make it work.
You're going to have your cult of machine. And everybody's going to be like, yes, this works.
So the funniest thing to me now is like when that happened, I think I was about 2/3 through the draft of the new novel I'd written, which has absolutely nothing to do with this world. It's like a completely different universe set 1,000 years in the future. I was 2/3 of the way through and I was like, I hadn't made a timeline for that because there's long stretches of time in this book because space travel. And I was like, no, you know what? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to figure out when stuff's happening because there's multiple plot threads again. And if I don't do it now, it's going to come back to bite me in the ass. So it was good. I did that exercise. And I think I've been scared straight. Like for any future novel, I'm going to get that timeline sorted out up front.
Oh, dear.
So just a quick anecdote. You're not alone in this. Raymond Chandler wrote The Big Sleep. The book went through the editorial process, was published, became a bestseller, got optioned, got made into a movie. And then the director asked him, I still haven't figured out who killed the chauffeur. Neither had Raymond Chandler. And no one had noticed in all that time.
Oops.
Amazing what we can gloss over, right?
Some rando just took out the chauffeur. It happens, right?
Yeah, it was just a mugging,
Yeah. Oops.
Oops. Oh man.
Yeah. These are I guess the perils of writing tightly plotted stories.
Yeah. But I will tell you that I did have a moment when I was like, for one of my books where I was like, the timing's a little tight here, but if I assume that they're 3 hours later, which they are, then this probably works. Like there are time zones, so it should be okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
But honestly,
those
I'm really impressed that you worked out what was going on between China and the US, because that's a tricky one.
Yeah, it is. It hurt me, but then it also ended up saving me in a couple spots where I was like, oh wait, it's actually, this much earlier in the US. So I'm fine. This can still happen.
Hey, I have a few hours.
Yeah, like I bought myself 6 hours. Yeah, because even in the US, some of it's on the West Coast and some of it's, in the DC area on the East Coast. So that also changes, the relative time between the two things. And obviously these two characters are communicating with each other on a regular basis. So, if Nithya is calling Welga and it's morning in Chennai, it has to be, 12 hours later if she's in San Francisco where she lives, or 9 hours later if she's in DC. And that can be, the difference between like daylight and darkness.
Yeah.
So all these little details, right? Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Good
cool
times.
though. I mean, that's one of the things that makes it really come across as super grounded and like, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth every bit of that, right? I would hope that you would feel that way. But I mean, to me, that makes the perfect sense.
Yeah, it's a very just like with runtime, I would say it's very relatable science fiction for people who don't think they typically like science fiction because spaceships and aliens and time travel, like none of that happens. I mean, there's rockets, but they're not that different from the rockets that we're dealing with today going up to space stations, which are, not that different from the ones we're dealing with today, just bigger with more people on them. And so, yeah, I had one reviewer so far, one reader on Instagram who said that this was the book that has won her over to science fiction. She didn't think she was going to like it. And she's like, now I'm a sci-fi fan. I'm like, yay.
Yeah.
Got one more.
Right. We're taking over the world.
Welcome to the dark side. We have cookies.
Yeah. We have cookies and ray guns and spaceships and aliens. Time
That's
travel.
right. You're just jealous of my jetpack. Cool.
Yes, there are no flying cars in our future by the end of the century. I'm sorry to say, or at least not widespread in daily use. People keep wanting that, and I'm like, I know it's cool, but it's not practical. I really don't think it's gonna happen. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Or at most it could be some kind of bizarre recreational activity in a particular area.
Yes, I have those people. I have these people called X Factors whose entire lives and livelihoods are built around doing ridiculous and highly risky stunts in order to earn money. So yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I
to
should
me.
write like a short story about an X Factor and a flying car.
Oh yeah, I totally want to see that now.
Yeah, in real life, there are parkour people who do that, right? They make money doing parkour stunts and occasionally get killed.
Yeah, the word, so in Machinehood, I made it a word, EXFACTOR, X Factor, like all one word, but there's actually, there was a show, I think, called The X Factor that was basically about people pulling these kind of nutty stunts, and that was totally my inspiration. I stole it unabashedly from that. I was like, oh yeah, X Factors, there are these people who do this, and since there's cameras everywhere, they can be doing, stuff anywhere all the time.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, and I'm always super appreciative of anytime somebody engages with the question of the minutia of daily existence, and what I'm seeing in your work is that you've put a lot of thought into it, and understanding the kinds of social pressures that would be created by these kinds of technological changes. I mean, one of the things that I always like to ask is, well, how does this change the way that we talk? Did you go into that aspect of it as well?
Not too much with this. I had more linguistic stuff in runtime. With Machinehood, it's pretty straightforward, but I played with a few words where I took words that we use today and gave them a very different meaning. In 2095, sort of the way I was looking at the word computer and how its meaning has changed, right, over the past 100 years. And so I picked a few words like that still exist 75 years from now, but the definition of it has changed, and the usage has changed from what we have today, including pill, right? I mean, these days pills mean typically some sort of chemical thing that you're ingesting that dissolves and acts in a biochemical fashion in your body. The pills of the future they use drugs specifically for the chemistry, and the pills are actually these micro machine devices that you ingest.
Yeah.
Can you give another example?
Yeah, kitchen. Kitchens of the future do all your cooking and pretty much your cleaning for you. They don't actually clean, they just recycle their stuff and print new ones because they all have printers in their kitchen. So kitchens print your pills, make your food, recycle and reprint your dishes, and are potentially reconfigurable physically. A lot of the hard structures in this world are made of smart matter that can reconfigure itself. And so the word kitchen is used not as in a place I go cook, but as in a thing that provides me with, a lot of the stuff that I need.
And I'm assuming it's still room shaped.
It's more like a giant appliance. So
Okay.
it's not a room anymore. It's like a very large robotic device that lives somewhere in your house, but is not necessarily a room, because you're not in the kitchen, you use the kitchen.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
cool.
so that's another one.
I'm
geeking out over here.
What's that?
I said I want to live in that part of the future. I want a kitchen
Yeah.
that'll do the cooking and do the dishes and all of that. It's like a washing machine, right? How that?
Yeah. You have all this interesting speculation about the future. You haven't even touched upon the climate change that's sand is devouring Phoenix and all this stuff you have. One thing I wanted to ask you about, since it seems a little out of left field, although it's important to the plot, is how did you come up with the whole idea of what's happening in the Maghreb?
Oh, okay, I got to explain this without spoiling for people who haven't read the book.
Spoil either.
Okay, all right. Let me explain it in terms of the history. How about that? So I was, I mentioned the global foresight reports and like the geopolitics types of stuff, and this is actually where I was talking with my State Department friend. She's like one of my internet friends. I have never met this person in person, but we have known each other via the internet for basically the entire lives of our children. Someone I met on through a pregnancy forum discussion. So anyway, I wanted to take certain aspects of today's geopolitics and turn them on their heads, just for fun. So the two places I did that were in North Africa and Asia. In Asia, what I did was I took the enmity right now, or maybe not enmity, that's probably too strong of a word, but like the slight hostility between India and China, and turned it into a cooperative relationship. Like what would happen to the world if India and China actually decided to combine forces, right? And become Asian superpower bloc. And then in North Africa, I went a different direction. I was thinking about this sort of, biotech factors that include a certain amount of, being able to modify gene expression and things like that as well, right? But where would that kind of stuff arise? Like, where's a natural place that this could arise that we wouldn't necessarily think of, right? Like, we'd probably think of the US and Europe and blah, blah, blah. But I was like, what if Christianity got a stronger foothold, right? And said, you can't do this kind of research that you need to do in order to develop genetic engineering knowledge and biotechnology. And so where else in the world might be, sufficiently unregulated and unsupervised where this kind of stuff could happen? So some of that is what is why. So the Maghreb is basically another word for a certain portion of North Africa. And so I was like, how about there, right? Like plenty of smart people and they need an industry, right? And so this would be a way for them to build wealth. And this is not because it's a thing you can do now in your living room, right? Just like if you had a laptop, you don't need to have large amounts of capital and resources the way you do today in the pharmaceutical industry in order to thrive. So, so India, China, and North Africa are basically the what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, but the origins or the primary places that these technologies flourished, right, in this particular future. And part of that was, again, like I said, I just wanted to take certain of our assumptions and turn them on their heads. And it's like, you know, what's a unlikely place, right? That, you know, I felt like with South America, again, there's a religious element that's very foundational to the culture there, and it would be hard, maybe even harder to overcome there than it is in the US and Europe. Whereas Islam has had a very interesting history with some of this stuff. And there have been periods where there have been, you know, like in the golden age of their reckoning, or maybe our reckoning, I'm not sure who coined that, but in a certain period of time, right, there was a lot of science and math and arts being developed under Islamic rule. So I was like, why not that again, right? Like, let's take all our assumptions about this culture and flip it just for fun.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we've hit 5 o'clock. It happens quickly when we're having fun. This is a fascinating world, Divya. I'm so glad you could come on the show and talk to me about it. Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, get in touch if you have future projects that you would like to talk about. I didn't even get to ask you about your other projects, but let's talk about them another time, perhaps.
Yeah, like not a ton I can talk about. So I will say, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Very fun talking to all of you. And as far as new stuff, totally free project put on by ASU, Arizona State University Center for Science and the Imagination. You can go to their website and download a free book called Cities of Light. That is another very near future. They said our mandate was 20 to 40 years from now, where we had to envision a solar powered city and set a short story in there. And I got to do a narrative hackathon with people from the National Renewables Energy Lab, and in my case, a grad student of environmental justice from Puerto Rico, and put all this stuff together and come up with a 5,000 word story, as did 3 other authors. So if you like solar punk and optimistic futures, you know, definitely check that out.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take us off of live streaming, and thank you to everyone who may have been watching.